The plastic room key was pressed into my palm, while my suitcase rolled away down a hallway that smelled like bleach and overcooked vegetables. A staff member checked my name off a clipboard. My phone buzzed once, then went silent. Outside the window, the parking lot gate slid shut. Somewhere else, a door I owned was already being opened. Before I go on, let me ask you something quietly. Where are you listening from right now? What time of day is it there? I ask because moments like this don't arrive loudly. They slip in while life is still moving, while you think nothing important is happening. If stories like this help you notice those moments sooner, or help you protect someone you care about, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with me. Let's move to the story. What happened next only makes sense if you don't look away. I had always been particular about my mornings. Not obsessive, just steady. Coffee first, brewed the same way every day. 2 scoops, no rush. The radio stayed low, just enough to hear the weather between the static. I liked knowing if rain was coming before I stepped outside. The kitchen window faced the street, and from there I could see who was walking early, who had changed their routine, who was new to the block. It was how I kept track of the world without needing to be in it too much. The house was small, but it worked. Everything had its place. Shoes lined up by the door. Mail opened at the table, never standing. Bills paid on Tuesdays. Trash out on Thursdays. I kept a spiral notebook in the drawer beside the phone with dates, numbers, and reminders written in my own hand. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I liked seeing proof that things were handled. I drove myself. Not far, mostly to the grocery store, the hardware place, and the library. The car was old but reliable. I knew the sound it made when it needed oil, the way the steering wheel pulled just slightly left on the highway. At the store, the cashier knew my name. At the library, the woman at the desk would hold the new mysteries for me behind the counter if I asked. These were small freedoms, but they added up. My son worried. That part was new, but not sudden. It came in pieces. A comment about the stairs. A look when I reached for something high. A question about whether I'd locked the door. I answered the same way every time. Calm. Brief. I didn't argue. I didn't joke. I just answered. He came by more often after that. Not every day. Enough to notice. He would stand in the doorway too long, glance at the corners of rooms, open cabinets without asking. Once, I found him flipping through the notebook by the phone. He smiled when I looked up, said he was just curious how I stayed so organized. I let it go. He talked about safety a lot, about how things happen fast, about how people don't always notice changes in themselves. He said it gently, like he was choosing each word carefully. I listened. I nodded. I didn't interrupt. I had learned long ago that silence sometimes made people reveal more than questions ever could. I trusted him. Not blindly, but naturally. He was my son. He had grown up in this house. He knew which floorboard creaked, which window stuck in winter. When he suggested small adjustments, I made them. A grab bar in the shower. A brighter bulb over the stairs. Things that didn't cost me anything. The conversation shifted before I noticed it had. One day it was about convenience. The next, about support. Then about options. He mentioned a place he'd toured. Clean. Quiet. Staff on hand, just in case. He said it wasn't permanent. Just a trial. Somewhere I could rest while they handled a few things. I didn't pack much. A suitcase. A box of books. My watch. I left the house tidy. Lights off. Doors locked. I told myself it was temporary because that word was used often and carefully. Standing in that hallway with my name checked off and my phone suddenly quiet, I thought about the notebook still in the drawer by my phone at home. I wondered who would open it next and what they would decide it meant. The first change was my phone. It stopped working the way it always had. Calls that used to ring now went straight to voicemail. Messages arrived late or not at all. When I mentioned it at the front desk, the woman smiled and said the building had spotty reception. She offered the common room phone if I needed to call someone. I declined. I didn't like speaking about personal things where anyone could hear. My son started answering for me. When staff asked questions, dietary preferences, medication timing, emergency contacts, he was already there, already talking. He stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm through my sleeve. He used words like "we've decided" and "it's best if." No one challenged him. No one looked at me for confirmation. Paperwork appeared on clipboards, pages with highlighted sections, signature lines already marked with yellow tabs. I was told it was standard intake, temporary authorizations, nothing permanent. I was handed a pen more than once while standing, while distracted, while someone waited politely but expectantly. I asked for copies. I was told they'd be emailed. They weren't. My room was neat but unfamiliar. Beige walls. A bed that wasn't mine. A small dresser with drawers that stuck. The window faced a parking lot instead of my street. At night, headlights swept across the ceiling like slow-moving searchlights. I slept lightly. When I asked about going home for an afternoon, the answer changed each time. The car was unavailable. The schedule was full. The staff needed more notice. My son said we'd talk about it later. He said I should focus on settling in. My mail stopped arriving. At first, I assumed it was a delay. Then I realized I hadn't seen a single envelope with my name on it since I arrived. No flyers, no library notices, no handwritten notes from the neighbor who always sent holiday cards too early. I asked at the desk. The clerk checked the computer and said my mail was being forwarded. She didn't know where. She said it was arranged during intake. I hadn't arranged anything. When I called my son, he sounded busy. He said forwarding mail was simpler, less clutter. He said I didn't need to worry about bills right now. He said he was handling things. Handling things meant decisions being made without me. The notebook I kept by the phone, my spiral with dates and figures, never made it to my room. I asked about it once. My son said he'd look for it. He never mentioned it again. Visitors became complicated. A friend from the library showed up one afternoon and was told I was resting. I wasn't. I was sitting by the window watching a delivery truck idle in the lot. She texted me later to say she'd try again another time. I stopped asking people to come. One afternoon, while waiting for the elevator, I overheard 2 staff members talking. They weren't whispering. They were discussing logistics, a move-out timeline, repairs, a realtor. I stepped closer, just enough to hear the address. It was mine. I didn't say anything then. I waited. That evening, I borrowed the common room computer. It took a few tries to remember my email password. When the screen finally loaded, there was a message flagged as read. A listing confirmation. Photos attached. My front porch. My kitchen window. The street I watched every morning. The date on the email was a week earlier. I printed it. The printer jammed. I cleared it carefully, page by page, until the paper slid out warm in my hands. I folded it once and put it in my pocket. At dinner, my son talked about plans, about efficiency, about how things would be easier once everything was settled. He didn't mention the listing. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I asked him calmly why my house was online. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said nothing had been finalized. He said it was better to act quickly before the market shifted. He said I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance anymore. He said this as if it were already done. Later that night, a staff member knocked and asked me to hand over my house keys for safekeeping. She said it was policy when residents no longer needed outside access. I didn't argue. I placed the keys in her open palm. She thanked me and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and took the folded paper from my pocket. The printer ink had smudged slightly. The photos were clear enough. Somewhere beyond that parking lot, my front door no longer belonged to me. After that, the days began to lose their edges. Not all at once, slowly. Like a photograph left too long in the sun. Morning still came, but it no longer belonged to me. Lights flicked on at the same hour every day. Breakfast trays arrived whether I was hungry or not. Someone knocked before entering, but they didn't wait for an answer. My name was spoken often, kindly even, yet it no longer felt attached to me. It was a label, not an address. I started noticing how often people spoke around me instead of to me. Staff discussed my schedule while standing at the foot of my bed. My son spoke with administrators in the hallway, his voice low and steady, using phrases like, "She doesn't really need to be involved, and it's already handled." When I stepped closer, conversations paused. Smiles returned. The subject changed. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the hardest part. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no moment where someone said, "You don't get a say anymore." Instead, my say simply stopped being required. Decisions arrived already made. Plans existed without my input. Updates were delivered like courtesy announcements after the fact. I asked fewer questions because the answers were vague. I asked again because silence felt worse. Eventually, I stopped asking altogether. My belongings were pared down without discussion. A cardigan I liked went missing, then a pair of shoes. I assumed they'd been misplaced until I overheard someone mention donations. I didn't ask where my things had gone. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. Each small absence felt like proof that my presence was optional. The calendar on the wall still showed dates, but they no longer meant anything. I didn't know when I'd be going outside again. I didn't know if I was allowed to. When I asked about a walk, I was told someone would check availability. No one did. Time became something I waded through instead of used. At night, the building settled into a hush broken by distant coughing and the soft squeak of carts rolling down the hall. I lay awake listening, trying to locate myself in the dark. I recited addresses in my head. My old phone number. The street name where I'd lived for decades. I held on to details the way you hold on to a railing in unfamiliar stairs. I began to wonder how others saw me now. As someone fragile, someone confused, someone who needed things simplified. That word again, simplified. It followed me everywhere. It explained why mail didn't reach me, why calls were redirected, why my opinions were summarized instead of quoted. I tested the boundaries once. I told a nurse I needed to review my paperwork. She smiled and said my family had copies. I asked for them anyway. She said she'd put in a request. Nothing came of it. I asked my son, during one of his visits, if I could see what had been signed. He said it would only upset me. He said I should trust him. He said stress wasn't good for me. I nodded because arguing required energy I didn't have. But inside, something settled heavy and cold. Not fear, not rage. Something quieter. The understanding that my credibility was gone. That if I said I was capable, it would sound like denial. That if I objected, it would be framed as confusion. That realization pressed down harder than any locked door. I watched other residents. Some wandered the halls calling names no one answered. Some stared at televisions without sound. Some slept through entire afternoons. I wondered how many of them had arrived the same way I had, with suitcases packed by someone else, with assurances made on their behalf. One afternoon, rain streaked the windows and the parking lot filled with reflections. I stood there longer than necessary, tracing familiar shapes in the distance. I imagined my house in that rain, the way water pooled near the front step, the way the maple tree dropped leaves into the gutter. I didn't know if the lights were on anymore. I didn't know who had walked through my rooms. I didn't know what I was allowed to want. That was the heaviest loss of all. Not the house, not the objects, the uncertainty about whether my wanting still mattered. Yet even in that quiet erosion, I began to notice patterns, small ones, inconsistencies, dates that didn't line up, statements that shifted slightly each time they were repeated. I didn't act on them. I didn't comment. I simply noticed. And I kept noticing, because when everything else is taken, attention is still yours to keep. I stopped pushing back. Not because I agreed, and not because I was tired of caring. I stopped because resistance had started to work against me. Every question was noted. Every objection was smoothed over and quietly filed away as further evidence that I shouldn't be making decisions at all. So I let the days pass. I thanked staff when they brought meals. I nodded when schedules were explained. I accepted phrases like, "We'll take care of that," and "Your family's already handled it." I made myself easy. Not invisible, but agreeable. That gave me space. When people believe they've won, they loosen their grip. They speak more freely. They stop checking every word. I listened. I learned which staff rotated through my floor on which days. I learned who followed procedure carefully and who cut corners to save time. I learned that one receptionist always logged deliveries late in the afternoon and another preferred handwritten notes before entering anything into the system. None of it mattered on its own. Together, it formed a map. I asked for small things that seemed harmless. A printed copy of the weekly activity schedule. A list of the facility's policies for my daughter who worries. A confirmation of my mailing address because a friend keeps forgetting it. These were ordinary requests. They didn't raise alarms. I started keeping notes again. Not in a spiral notebook this time. Loose paper, folded and tucked into the lining of my purse. Dates. Times. Names. Exact phrases. When my son said something slightly different from the week before, I wrote both versions down. When staff referenced instructions that didn't match what I'd been told earlier, I noted that too. I paid attention to paperwork. Forms were mentioned often. Authorizations. Agreements. Temporary arrangements. I noticed how frequently the word temporary was used without a defined end. I noticed which documents had my name printed and which required my signature. I noticed how often someone else's handwriting appeared next to my name. I never asked for explanations in the moment. I asked later casually when it wouldn't interrupt anything. Sometimes I got answers, sometimes I didn't. Both were useful. I waited for mail. Not the absence of it, but the evidence of where it was going. One afternoon, a staff member mentioned forwarding delays and referenced an address that wasn't mine. She caught herself and corrected it, but the first version stayed with me. I wrote it down. I listened during visits. My son talked more than he realized. He filled silences with reassurance. He explained plans as if narrating a process already in motion. When people are confident, they repeat themselves. The repetition made it easier to hear the gaps. I didn't confront him about the house again. I let him assume the question had passed. He began speaking about timelines instead of possibilities. About after everything is settled. About once this chapter is closed. Each phrase was another thread. I watched how my access changed. Keys had been taken, but passwords shifted too. Accounts I could no longer view. Messages I could no longer open. When I asked for information, I was given summaries instead of originals. I didn't object. I thanked them. At night, I organized my thoughts the way I used to organize my bills. Line by line. What I knew. What I didn't. What could be proven. What would need support beyond my word. I understood something clearly then. If I protested loudly, the story would become about my stability. If I waited, the story could stay about facts. So I waited. I waited while routines hardened into expectations. I waited while my son grew comfortable with control. I waited while decisions continued without my approval. And all the while, I kept my attention sharp and my reactions small. Because this wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about allowing the full shape of the truth to reveal itself, unchallenged, uninterrupted, and documented. When the moment came to speak, I wanted the record to speak first. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning after breakfast and before lunch, when everyone was alert but not rushed. That timing mattered. It meant calendars were open. It meant records were accessible. It meant no one could say they hadn't been prepared. I asked for it myself, not dramatically, not urgently. I told the front desk I needed a care review. I used the language they understood. I said I wanted to clarify documentation and next steps. I asked that my son attend. I asked that the facility administrator be present as well. No one hesitated. Reviews were routine. Questions were allowed. I had earned that much by being cooperative. I brought my purse. Inside it were the folded pages I had been collecting for weeks. Notes, dates, printouts. A short list of addresses, copies I had requested quietly and received without comment. Nothing sensational, just orderly. The conference room was small, neutral. A table, 4 chairs, a window that didn't open. The administrator arrived first, carrying a tablet. My son followed, phone in hand, already speaking before he sat down. He looked comfortable, assured. I waited. The administrator began with a summary. My care plan, my transition, the benefits of structure, the importance of consistency. She spoke clearly, professionally, reading from the screen. When she finished, I thanked her. Then I slid the first page across the table. It was a forwarding confirmation. The address listed wasn't mine. It wasn't the facility's either. The administrator frowned slightly and checked her tablet. The second page followed. A timeline. Intake date, mail forwarding date, listing date for my house. All in order. All in writing. She said no. Not without a separate legal arrangement. I placed the next page down. An authorization form. Not signed by me. My name printed. Another handwriting beside it. Dated after my arrival. The administrator's expression changed. Not alarm. Focus, I continued, evenly. I asked who had submitted the form. The answer came quickly. My son's name. Submitted electronically. Verified as a family representative. He opened his mouth to explain. I held up a hand. Not sharply. Just enough. I asked the administrator to review the activity log attached to the form. It showed edits made after submission, clarifications added, language adjusted, all without my presence. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy. It was procedural. I placed the final document on the table. A property listing confirmation. Date stamped. Agent contact information. Photos. The address was unmistakable. The administrator leaned back slightly. She didn't touch her tablet this time. She looked at me instead. I told her calmly that I had not consented to the sale, that I had not been presented with the paperwork in full, that my access to communication had been altered after intake, that decisions were being made under the assumption that my agreement was implied. I didn't accuse, I stated. He said it was in my best interest. He said he was protecting me from stress. The administrator raised a hand. She asked him to stop. She asked me a question instead. Whether I wished to retain full decision-making authority. I said yes. She asked whether I wished to continue residing there under revised terms. I said I would decide after my access was restored. She nodded once. From that point on, things moved cleanly. She documented the discrepancies. She noted the unauthorized submissions. She requested immediate suspension of any external actions taken on my behalf without written consent. She asked that my communication settings be reviewed and returned to resident control. She did all of this without raising her voice. My son sat very still. The administrator concluded the meeting by stating that until proper documentation was reviewed by third-party oversight, no further changes would be permitted. No asset movement, no property actions, no decision-making without my direct approval. She said it as policy, not judgment. The meeting ended shortly after. Outside the room, my son tried to speak. I told him I needed space. I said it quietly. He stopped. Within the hour, my phone was working properly again. Messages arrived all at once, missed calls, notifications, proof of absence made visible. That afternoon, I was given copies of every document associated with my stay. Printed. Complete. No highlights. I reviewed them in my room, door closed, light steady. Everything was there. The timelines matched my notes. By evening, the listing for my house was no longer active. No announcement was made, no apology offered. None was needed. The balance had shifted, not because I demanded it, because the record could no longer support the story being told about me. When I think back to that first moment, the weight of a plastic key pressed into my hand, my suitcase rolling away without me, I understand it differently now. It wasn't panic I felt then. It was disorientation, the quiet shock of being moved through my own life as if I were cargo instead of a person. What unsettled me most was not the building or the room or the rules. It was how easily my presence had been replaced by decisions made in my name. How quickly concern had become control. How a voice that once mattered was treated as background noise. I had always believed independence was loud, that you defended it with arguments, explanations, resistance. I learned instead that dignity can be quiet. That clarity doesn't need volume. It needs steadiness. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being spoken for. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in slowly. You begin to question whether your preferences are burdensome, whether your questions are inconvenient, whether your wanting still counts. That is a dangerous place to be, especially when it's dressed up as care. I don't think my son woke up one day intending to erase me. I think he told himself a story that made his choices easier to live with. That I was fragile. That I wouldn't understand. That efficiency mattered more than consent. Those stories are comforting to the person telling them. They are devastating to the person living inside them. What brought me back to myself wasn't confrontation. It was attention. I paid attention when others assumed I wouldn't. I stayed present when it would have been simpler to disappear into compliance. I didn't rush to be believed. I waited to be precise. That patience gave me something important. Not just my authority back, but my footing. The sense that I still belong to my own life. I don't feel victorious. That isn't the word. I feel aligned. With my values. With my boundaries. with the understanding that love without respect is not protection. It is possession. I also understand now that aging doesn't make us less deserving of agency. It makes agency more essential. When the world begins to simplify you, when decisions start arriving pre-made, it becomes your responsibility to insist, quietly, firmly, that you are still here. I am still here. I move more slowly now. I choose my battles carefully. I speak less, but I mean more. I know the difference between help and takeover, between support and substitution, and I know this with certainty. Dignity does not fade with age. It only disappears when we are convinced to give it away. I didn't give mine away. I held it steadily until the room adjusted around me. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll take a moment to sit with it. Many people experience concern that quietly becomes control, often without realizing when the line is crossed. If you face something similar, or if you're navigating care, family decisions, or aging with independence in mind, your perspective matters. You're welcome to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. And if you know someone who might need this reminder that dignity requires consent, consider passing it along. Stories like this are easier to face together.